our minds go to prophecy of things to come with the Messiah when we hear these words, "For to us a child is born." Even similar to those as Luke accounts the coming of Jesus and a child was going to be born, even as Mary was told by an angel that she was going to have a son. And so we relate these things. But really, when you look at the context, when you look at what's happening during this day and time, is that exactly what he's talking about? Or is there more to the picture? What is going on within the context of this happening? Go back to chapter 7 of Isaiah, and I want to kind of start into chapter 7 in the first part of it to introduce you, if you're not already familiar, with King Ahaz. King Ahaz was king of Judah. Now remember, you have the two kingdoms because it's a divided kingdom. The nation of Israel is not just the nation of Israel anymore. You have the northern tribes, and they have had their kings, and they're still existing at this point, but not for very long. But what has happened is you have the 10 tribes, the northern kingdom, you have the southern kingdom, which is the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, because Benjamin is exceptionally small and is just kind of joined with Judah. And so you have the southern kingdom. Well, Ahaz, he's king over the southern kingdom, over Judah. And so when we see the situation, and there are times when they get along, and there's times when they don't get along, and this is one of those particular times that they're not getting along at all, and King Ahaz is very afraid. He doesn't seem to be a faithful man. He doesn't seem to be one that is putting his trust in God. And if you look at the history of his reign, he's one of those that's listed basically as a wicked king. Some of the kings were good, but actually very few of them. Most of the kings over the nations of Israel and Judah were not good. And Ahaz is one of those that is not good. So beginning in verse 1 of chapter 7 says, "When Ahaz, son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, was king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram and Pekah, son of Remaliah," said that wrong, "Remaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it." Okay, so here's basically Syria and Israel coming against Judah. Sound familiar? We have two nations, Israel, which at one time, of course, was Israel and Judah together, God's people. They are coming against Jerusalem. They're laying siege against it. And at first, they're not able to overpower it. It says in verse 2, "Now the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. So the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind." It said Ahaz and his people were shaken like you see a tree shaking in the wind in the forest. Anybody ever sat in a tree in the woods? I know a few of you have. When the wind is blowing, it is amazing to see that happen. Remington and I got to experience this year just because of early time of going out and hunting together. As the leaves were falling, it was absolutely amazing and beautiful because it was like the whole world was just shedding around you, and it was because the wind was blowing. And of course, we were moving, and see this shaking happening. That's what was going on. Just like a forest, the trees shaking in the wind. It says Ahaz and his people, their hearts were shaking. They were scared. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out, you and your son, Shear-Jashub, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to Launderer's field. Say to him, be careful, be calm, and don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these two smoldering stubs of firewood." And he calls these two kings, these two smoldering stubs of firewood, or at least Israel and Aram. One or the other. He's either talking about the kings or he's talking about the nations. He says, "Because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram, and of the son of Remaliah, Aram, Ephraim, and Remaliah's son has plotted your ruin, saying, let us invade Judah, let us tear it apart and divide it among ourselves, and make the son of Tabeel king over it. Yet this is what the sovereign Lord says." So he tells him, he says, be careful, Keep calm, don't be afraid. Because they are determined that they're going to rise up against you, overthrow you. They're going to make this other man king. Don't be afraid. Here's what the sovereign Lord says. Verse 7. It will not take place. It will not happen. For the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is only Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is only Remaliah's son. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. Stop shaking, Ahaz. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. Don't be afraid. It's not going to happen. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or in the highest heights. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. Here God is sending this message, whether he's speaking to Ahaz, and of course Isaiah is the one that is sent to tell him these things. And so I get the impression that it's just simply a continuation of that, and God is speaking through Isaiah, and he tells him, ask God for a sign, whether this is going to happen or not. Ahaz says, I'm not going to ask God. I'm not going to put God to the test. So he's refusing to do this. Then Isaiah, verse 13, said, Hear now, you house of David. Is it not enough to try the patience of humans? Will you try the patience of my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid to waste. The Lord will bring on you and on your people and on the house of your father a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. There's more that he goes on to describe Assyria, and Assyria is the nation that then overthrows the northern kingdom, not Ahaz's, but the northern kingdom that Ahaz is so afraid of right now. And so he's telling Ahaz, ask God for a sign. Ahaz says, I'm not going to ask for a sign. You almost get the impression Ahaz knows he doesn't really want to hear from God. He doesn't really want to hear what God is going to say because he's not in line with God. And yet what God has to tell him at this point is somewhat comforting. Now, it's not going to stay that way, but what he's going to tell him about this particular situation is, don't be afraid, this isn't going to happen. But it's interesting when he says, are you going to put God to the test? I mean, are you going to try God's patience? You say you're not going to put him to the test, but are you going to try his patience like you try man's patience? God says, ask me for a sign, and you say, no, I'm not going to ask you for a sign. Well, I'll give you a sign. And it almost sounds like a parent talking to a child, doesn't it? You know, just ask me. No, I'm not going to ask you. Well, I'll tell you. And so God says, I'll give you a sign. And it's interesting what he says. He says here, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. Now we look at this passage, and this is theologically in what's called higher learning, and I'm not sure we should even call it that sometimes, debated and debated and debated over who this is talking about. Well, you don't really have to wonder who this is talking about. All you have to do is turn to Matthew, right? Before I go any further in Isaiah,